Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Aaron Porras, and today it's time to talk about Iran, which is probably not in the way that you're used to, because today we are playing some war games. But first, some setup. Iran's still at a stalemate with world powers in Vienna over how to return to the currently defunct JCPOA nuclear agreement. Iran inching closer and closer to a nuclear breakout while demanding that the United States return to the deal and lift sanctions on Tehran. Meanwhile, the P5+1 powers are looking for ways to get Iran to return to compliance before signing on the renewed dotted line. And this brings us to our hypothetical scenario. The JCPOA and other attempts to preemptively take out Iran's nuclear activities have all failed. So, having reached military nuclear breakout, Iran now activating its proxies and calling on its allies to join in an expanded regional conflict. Israel, for its part, responding to the existential threat. Joining us to discuss, professor for the Department of Middle Eastern History of Tel Aviv University and the former director for the Alliance Center on Iranian Studies, Professor Meir Litvak. Then research fellow at the Institute for Counterterrorism at the IDC Herzliya and former senior staff member in the U.S. Congress, Dr. Fadi Ismail. Next, adjunct associate professor, of political science at Columbia University and former deputy national security advisor in Israel, Dr. Chuck Freilich. And finally, last but not least, research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center of Tel Aviv University, Nir Bones. Gentlemen, thank you all so much for joining us. I'm really excited for this discussion. Please feel free to discuss amongst each other and address one another directly. But let's get started with the givens and the near givens. Who will join in the so-called belligerents? Who will comprise the two sides of the conflict? And Dr. Freilich, I'll start with you. I'll let you take us off.
First of all, let me say that I actually think that the scenario is not realistic in one sense, in that I do not believe that the state of Israel will, or for that matter, should allow this scenario to emerge, and that we will take all measures necessary to prevent Iran from going nuclear, and the United States may as well. But if it happens, and of course it could, then the sides, I think, are relatively clear. It's the United States and its allies in the world, mostly France, Britain, Germany, and some other states. It's Israel, and it's the Gulf states on one side. And on the other side, it's the so-called axis of resistance, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and some others.
Well, so how do states like Russia or even North Korea and China fit into the larger conflict? Are they irrelevant? Would they try not to be involved?
No, they're not at all irrelevant. Not Russia, because it has had long-standing ties with Iran. It's been closely involved in this issue. And not China, which has got an increasingly close relationship with Iran, especially in the last year following the signing of the New Deal between the two countries. None of them wants to see a nuclear crisis in the region. And so I think this will be one of those rare cases where there will be an overall international attempt to keep a lid on things and to prevent it from reaching the kind of critical stage that we're talking about here.
Dr. Ismail, do you agree with Dr. Freilich's assessment and with the scenario as I've presented it, or do you agree that it won't even get that far?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I think that this scenario is a little bit too fast in terms of the speed by which it goes into belligerence, to actual war. It reminds me about 20 years ago, I observed another exercise that took place in DC that was playing exactly the same questions, a possible war between the United States and we called it the Red State, which really was Iran. And the scenarios that we started with were kind of similar to what you are talking about. Very quickly, two things became clear. One of them is that it is really of no interest to the U.S. at all to engage militarily with Iran. And the second one was that nobody really knows what will be the outcomes of such a clash. In fact, the general who played the Red State, played Iran, managed to defeat the US Navy within less than 7 or 8 hours with very, very simple tools. And well, yeah, we're 20 years later. I'm not sure that all the lessons from that exercise were, and that was a very big exercise, about $300 million expense. I think it is very clear to the US, this kind of a direct clash with the Iranians is not in our favor, is not something that we want. That area is very critical to the world economy. Shipping lanes, commerce, energy supply to major forces such as China. Any disruption of energy supply to China might drag the Chinese into direct involvement, because otherwise, this is a lifeblood. I mean, they really cannot operate the country without that energy. So this thing can very quickly escalate into a world war, and I don't think that there's anyone in Washington, D.C. who is remotely interested in that. So I do think, and I think that the previous speaker, Mr. Freilech, would agree with me, and maybe the others as well, that it just escalated a little too fast in your scenario, in my opinion.
So, Professor Litvak, I'll turn to you. How do you see a potential scenario breaking out or progressing in the Middle East?
Well, I agree with the two previous speakers. First of all, Iran will not start the war by itself. I would say that Iran doesn't want to fight. Iran uses proxies to advance its goals. Iran always claims it is the defense. It only reacts and responds. It does not attack anyone. It is not an aggressive state. Therefore,
would it be fair to say that by activating its proxies, it is still attacking another state just by proxy? Yes. It is still instigating in that case.
Of course. But let's say Iran decides to do so. First of all, you have to find a good excuse, a good pretext, in order to deprive Israel the reason, the justification, the legality to attack Iran by itself. Iran does not want to have a direct Iranian-Israeli war because the cost may be too high. I fully agree with, by the way, Dr. Ismail, the cost will be very high for the US as well. But since Iran being a rational state, not necessarily moderate and positive, but rational, that works on a cost-benefit analysis, going on a direct war with Israel is not in Iran's interest. Using proxies while hinting at the possibility that Iran will be forced to protect its proxies is something else. But I would say that it is, let's say, even if Iran reaches nuclear capability, going on a war against Israel will not be the first priority. But they may use it in order to expand their goals. By the way, I would say the first priority would be to drive the US completely out of Iraq and to ensure Iranian hegemony in Iraq and in the Persian Gulf. Then maybe facing Israel. Because we have to remember that as much as we are important to Iran, Iraq and the Persian Gulf it's not backyard, it's front yard. They are the most crucial arenas for Iran, and therefore, Iran would, in my view, would try to advance its interests and goals there first. But again, if there is something happens, some escalation, then again, Iran will use proxies while hinting that it may be forced to do something more drastic. But I doubt very much that Iran, on its own initiative, would go to war against Israel.
All right, so Mr. Bohms, I haven't heard from you yet. I'd like to bring you in. Bouncing off of what we just discussed with Dr. Litvak, or Professor Litvak, do you believe that, or rather, where do you think this conflict would actually materialize, and in what way? Would a conflict primarily be in Iraq and Syria, for example, maybe even spilling over into Lebanon with the presence of Hezbollah, or would there be some other manifestation?
Look, details are important here, and I think my colleagues have already commented on that. There is a difference between the ability to enrich enough material to manufacture a bomb, the ability to actually manufacture that bomb, and the ability to put that bomb on, let's say, a cruise missile and demonstrating that you're able to launch it to a distance, let's say, toward Israel. There are a few other things in the middle that potentially can come through a scenario. For example, an EMP, which is electromagnetic pulse, which is one of the more or less advanced forms of a nuclear fusion that is blown outside the atmosphere and then can take the electricity grid for the entire country of Israel, which is something that the Iranians, according to some of the reports, have studied, and something that the Soviets have done already in the 60s. And of course, each one of these scenarios, depending on the announcements or the intelligence that shows that Iran has moved to another phase, may trigger another part of a response. In your scenario, and I would agree that there is some, I wouldn't say that this is the most realistic, as my colleagues have already commented, but really the fear that Israel had expressed for such a scenario is not just because Iran appears a non-rational actor. It actually appears a fairly rational actor. But if part of the rationale is putting this in the hands of proxies who potentially can be slightly less rational, then we have a change of equation. We already have a war with Iran in Syria. We already have a war with Iran in Iraq, with a nuclear umbrella or with a different ability of responding. That may just change this equation of this conflict, will make it more dangerous. Israel, of course, will do whatever it can to make sure that we're not going to get there. And I'll agree with Dr. Freilich that Israel will probably be pushed to respond in a different way to prevent it. Quietly, less quietly, with operations on the ground, with allies, or with more drastic measures, again, depending on the evolution of such a scenario. I don't think Israel will sit quietly if Iran will be demonstrably able to show that it is able to produce a bomb and put it on a missile and have the ability to actually launch it.
All right, so Dr. Freilich, back to you then, or Freilich, I'm sorry. How would you see this progressing in a more realistic way? Again, now coming off of course, what Mr. Bohm's also just said. Especially, actually, and also within the context of the fact that the JCPOA is floundering, that the P5+1 powers and Iran are struggling, if not failing, to come to terms.
Well, we don't know how that's going to evolve. We could have a new deal in a matter of weeks or months, or we might not have one at all. So I don't know that there's a great deal that we can do to address that scenario at the moment. We're talking here about a scenario which is that Iran does either cross the threshold or approach the threshold, and that is an extremely dangerous scenario, because when states go nuclear, every other conflict below the nuclear level raises the danger that an otherwise limited conflict can now become an existential one. And we are already engaged in a number of conflicts with Iran, whether it's in Syria and Lebanon, and according to various reports, maybe Iraq and elsewhere. All of these scenarios and other conflicts in the region in which we are or are not involved would all then risk this danger of rising to the existential level. And that's, of course, an intolerable danger. States behave very differently in those circumstances. I do not think that we would be able to act as freely as we do today in Syria if Iran crosses the threshold. Now, all sides will be constrained. Iran has to take into account that Israel has the nuclear capability that's attributed to it. Everyone will have to be careful. I think what we will see is a continuation of the kind of under the radar, partially under the radar, hybrid warfare that we've seen in recent years. Iran may feel emboldened to do a bit more of this, and that increases the risk factor for us. And we, I presume, will also have to do more under the radar, more of the so-called campaign between the campaigns kind of activity. Have to be very cautious with that. There might be a greater tendency in these circumstances to look even more at areas such as cyber.
All right. Well, I want to talk now again with you, Professor Litvak. The support internally within a country at war is often as important, if not more important, for winning that war than any sort of other ability. So, what do you think the morale or the support locally in Iran and in Israel and elsewhere would be for such a conflict, and how would that affect the outcome?
I think it would affect the beginning. There is a problem for the Iranian government that there is growing resentment in Iran against the wasting of Iran resources on foreign adventures. In recent months, we saw in the previous protests, and we also saw manifestations in recent months where people have raised the slogan, no Gaza, no Lebanon, we only die for Iran. Why does the Iran government spend hundreds of millions of dollars on the Palestinians, when at the time when we are poor, we don't have enough food on our table, and so on? I think the Iranian government knows that it will not have widespread popular support if it starts a war against Israel. If, on the other hand, Iran is attacked, then the Iranian people would rally behind the regime because they are nationalists, they are patriots. And if they feel that Iran's sovereignty is at stake, that if Iran's independence is at stake, they would rally behind the regime. If, on the other hand, it is a war of adventure, an ideological war, which Iran initiates against others, I think that there will be little support for that. And therefore, I think, by the way, it will make the Iranian government more restrained. Not because it necessarily wants, but because it will realize that it does not have popular backing. By the way, we could see it in the last months or years of the Iran-Iraq war, when enthusiasm for the war in Iran was declining, the number of volunteers was declining. The Iranian government realized it did not have the public behind it. Okay? Therefore, I think being aware of the past, they would be much more careful before they launch any aggressive policy of their own.
So do you think that, truly, that the Iranian Ayatollah regime is waiting to be attacked, or rather just hoping, of course, as you said, not to have any sort of conflict, but waiting for the first shot to be fired at them, that they will not, because of this risk of losing public support, that they would not even attempt to instigate?
I think what Iran may try to do is to employ its proxies to do its work to do the work for Iran. And we could see, by the way, in recent months, if we look at what was happening in Iraq in recent months, Iran is employing Shia militias against the US. Again, engaging in low-level attacks against the US, just below the level that would force the US to retaliate forcefully, but still painful enough to inflict harm on the US in order to push the US out of Iraq. Again, they would probably try to do, if they would try something similar with Israel via Hezbollah. But we also have to remember that Hezbollah has a problem now. Hezbollah is facing severe problems in Lebanon because of the economic crisis, social economic crisis in Lebanon. The Lebanese public does not want to go to war when it doesn't have food and fuel, and when the Lebanese state is collapsing, and therefore Hezbollah is being increasingly criticized in Lebanon. Therefore, Iran has to walk on eggs, how it employs Hezbollah in Lebanon against Israel. It is careful how it employs the Shia militias in Iraq. But again, the Iranian modus operandi is to use proxies against its enemies, but in such a way as to deprive those enemies from the excuse and legitimacy to attack Iran itself.
All right, Dr. Ismail, if we're talking about proxies, if we're talking about various foreign governments being involved in this conflict, which I think we can all agree that would happen, who do you think might actually get into the way, who could become a pacifying force in the region? Could it be Jordan, for example, or even Turkey?
As a pacifying force?
to act as a buffer, you could say?
That's an interesting question. Of course, the Russians have a certain interest in the whole thing, but I think that it is beyond having a mediator, have a mediator in the middle to come in and tell everybody to calm down. I think we're way past that point. I think there are enough arguments for each party to avoid such open conflict that this has a cooling effect as it is. And I'm kind of dovetailing on the things that said my esteemed co-panelists. I think the game that both sides, and the very sophisticated two sides now, for them is to minimize exposure of their vulnerabilities, of the soft bellies. A direct military full-scale attack against Iran exposes many vulnerabilities that the U.S. and its world order has. So that's out of the window. Same goes for Iran. This is why the Iranians are basically shifting the risk by using tools of asymmetric warfare and hybrid warfare, such as proxies. But we also have such tools. And once these talks, if they fail, the fact that there are rumors that they're failing doesn't mean they're really failing. It could easily be a tactic to appease people, other American allies who don't like the negotiations, and by pretending like the negotiations are not working out, basically putting people to sleep, and all of a sudden they will show up with an agreement. That could happen. But let's say if they're really failing, if the negotiations are really failing, we could start going back to the Trump sanctions.
Wow.
Without calling them the Trump. They would call them something else because everything that Trump did was wrong, of course. So all of a sudden, we can see that those are tools that are not open warfare, that minimize the exposure of the West, specifically the exposure of the United States, and maximize the pressure on all of these various the vulnerabilities within the Iranian government structure, including raising the ire of the Iranian street, which is, as my esteemed colleagues have already pointed out, is just only rising more and more recently. And there's a new president there with big talk, but I'm not sure he can do what he claims he can do. So now it's a game of, okay, we are talking, and while in the meantime, everybody's looking for various points where they can, pressure points, if you will.
All right. Well, I for one, I know that we could keep talking about this for a long time. I really want to. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have. Thank you so much, Professor Meir Litvak, Nir Boms, Dr. Fadi Ismail, and Dr. Chuck Freilich for joining us. I'm Aaron Porras. Please tune in next time on Insider for more on everything Israel. If there's a topic that you would like us to cover next, let us know about it in the comment sections online. And finally, for more news from Israel, follow ILTV on Facebook and on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and ILTV.tv channels. Thank you so much. Be well. We'll see you soon.